Hello everyone, could I just ask everyone to take their seats because we are ready to kick off. I'm Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Thank you for joining us in the Con Home Marquee, kindly sponsored by OVO Energy for this, our small business event. Joining me is Dr. Liam Fox, former International Trade Secretary and has a long parliamentary career, and Tina McKenzie, the Policy Chair of the Federation of Small Business. And the topic that we're here to address today is how can the government create an environment that is better for small businesses. They're the overwhelming majority, I think it says 99% of all businesses in the United Kingdom. They employ huge numbers of people and they're absolutely crucial to driving economic growth. So what can government do to create a better environment for such firms? Now, the format is a fairly standard format. If you've been coming to Con Home events, we'll have some opening remarks from our speakers. I'll ask them a couple of questions as Chair's prerogative, and then we'll throw the questions out to you. Now, this is a conversation. As you can see, we don't have a long list of panellists, so I'm hoping that we can have a good free-flowing discussion and plenty of back and forth. Now, that's enough from me. Liam, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thank you, Henry, and thank you very much for inviting me. I thought that where Tina might talk more about the detail, I wanted to try to contextualise the debate around this. And the first thing I would say is that we have to break our obsession with growth as we currently define it as the measure of economic success. And I would draw a distinction between growth and wealth creation. And any idiot can spend tomorrow's money today and call the increased activity growth. Labour governments have been doing it since 1945. It's a well-proven path for them. You achieve wealth creation when you take the unique IP that any of us have and turn it into a good or a service that doesn't exist today, or a better good or service than exists today. And that's what we need to encourage. It's interesting when you talk to political groups around the country and you ask them what proportion of the workforce in this country is in the public sector. You know, think of your own answer to that question. And the general answer you get, around 40%, they'll say, of people work in the public sector. Actually, 17.5% of the workforce in Britain is in the public sector. It's just that when you are watching our media, they talk non-stop about the public sector and not about the wealth-creating sector of our economy, which in itself is quite instructive, I think. So we need to move our debate onto wealth creation, and therefore which bits of the economy will create more wealth for us. Because otherwise we get into a sterile debate about tax and spend, when what we actually should be talking about is how do we create more wealth in the country itself. The second thing I would say is, I know there's been a lot of talk and there's in some of the discussion around this about how we help startups, and helping startups is obviously really important. But what we really need to think about is how we help scale-ups in this country. When I chaired the Global Britain Commission, we did a very large piece of work around scale-ups. And if you look at the difference between the UK and the US, for example, in the UK, for scale-up finance, 85% comes from the banking sector and 15% from private equity. In the United States, it's 80% private equity and 20% from the banking sector. Now, I think that actually does produce, which we might want to discuss, a different cultural mentality. And I think we need to start to take more steps in the UK to move in that direction. We've had Solvency II, we've had the pension funds being opened up, which should lead us to up to 100 billion extra investment, but that remains to be seen. The third of the four things I would say is that the government needs to look to see if it does have money, how it can be putting its money into wealth creation and not simply into increased consumption. Because we need to get that wealth creating sector stronger if we're going to have the public finances at a level that will enable us to sustain what a lot of the public have come to expect at the present time. And the fourth thing I would say briefly is that we can't do any of these things unless we deal with some of the real elephants in the room, including our labour market and particularly our economic inactivity. If we look at those who are economically inactive in this country, that is not in work and not looking for work, that's currently 8.78 million people in the UK, and it's 334,000 more than it was before the pandemic. And interestingly, the House of Commons produced a report recently that although this is not a particularly high level, 21% of the population, working population in relation to historical norms, it was 25% in 1971, what we have seen is that many of those who are now economically inactive have chosen to declare themselves as long-term sickness, when in fact many of them left the labour market for other reasons, not long-term sickness. And there are all sorts of complex issues within that that government will need to tackle if we're going to be able to have the mobility in the labour market and to free up a lot of the skills that are out there, particularly at a time when people are able to work at home and some of the previous hindrances are no longer there. So we need a good dose of conservative supply-side reforms in our economy, and we have to be quite brave at taking on some of these elements that have almost become too deep in our national psyche, if we're going to actually create the environment that we like. Because if we don't, then you will have to choose between raising taxes all the time or cutting spending, which is not a fun debate to have when what smart countries are doing is increasing the wealth that they have in the first place.
Thank you, Liam. It's always fun when the word brave appears right there in the opening speech. Really sort of sets the tone for where we're going. Tina.
Thank you, Liam. I've heard a lot from Conservative ministers, politicians over the last number of months and years, really focusing on, let's stop talking about spending or increasing taxes. It's either, cut spending or do we increase taxes? And when you're comparing yourselves with Labour as well, that seems to be the conversation on people's lips at the moment. When in fact the conversation really should be is where is our economy today versus the last 10 years versus even the last 40 years? Where have we come as a UK in comparison to our competitors, be that European countries or other countries, for example, the Nordics? I don't often compare the UK economy to the US because there's just not a lot to compare with and not a lot, I think, to necessarily aim for when we're talking about productivity, better lives, better outcomes for everyone, including entrepreneurs. And a big question I have for you is the Conservative Party still the party of business? And when I say business, 99% of business up and down the country is small and medium. So I know you do talk a lot about to big businesses, and you also talk a lot to us at the FSB. You're very welcoming to us, and you take our opinions and invite us in. But the real question is, do you get it? And by getting it is, what are the small and medium businesses up and down the UK saying? Well, they're saying a few things. Firstly, of course, it's not your fault that COVID hit. Any government facing COVID around the Western world, really struggled and people struggled. But have we done the right things coming out of COVID, the whole Brexit scenario as well, in order to create a fertile bed for businesses to start up, not just scale up, but to start up? Remember, every big business was once a start-up business. So we must create more businesses and we must also help them scale up. So I do agree scale-ups are important as well. But when we look at the facts and figures, we look around the country and we say we have lost 500,000 businesses in the last few years. So how do we encourage the young people of today who are actually much more bought in to looking at other values than potentially maybe when I was younger and people went and joined the big corporates and got a career for 20 years. People want to do things that affect society in a very positive way and their communities in a positive way. And they want to really look at how they can help families around them, and they want to have a positive impact on the world. So the question is, how do we support young people start businesses? So we know that we offer 30, 40, 50,000 pounds of student loans if you want to go and, rightly so in a lot of cases, go on to university and do a degree. But if you don't and you want to start a business, what access to finance is there? Mum and dad, maybe. Call the credit union, maybe. Because the banks aren't necessarily lending to the SMEs up and down the country if you follow the trends of the lending. So the question really is, can the Conservatives really support the fertile bed and make a fertile bed for entrepreneurs to start up, scale up, and be protected in a very, very tough economy? We have a list of things that could really help the SMEs, and some of them, you know, you guys have really considered. But in terms of acting and making some real good policies around them, we would really like to see some commitment and show that you are the party of business, and that you are still in love with business. And when I say business, I mean the 99% of businesses up and down the country, which, by the way, interestingly, 17.5% are employed by the public sector, 65% are employed by SMEs. SMEs hire more people coming out of prison. SMEs hire more people that are long-term unemployed. SMEs offer more flexibility, not maybe in a written policy, but they're like family businesses and they support the people that work for them. So SMEs are fundamental to who we are, they're fundamental to our economy, they're fundamental to productive growth, but ultimately, and to close, they're fundamental to making the pie bigger. So it isn't about how we slice up the pie, it is simply about how we make the pie bigger in order that the spending we do require, speaking of labour market participation, the spending that we do require helps those waiting lists, helps people that are, for example, some of the 1.7 million women that want to work more hours but don't have enough childcare support to do so, that really support those types of people back into work, and even the young people who potentially need more support, and those that are disabled that want more support to start businesses. So we've got a long list of things we want to encourage you to do, and want to keep encouraging you to do, and actually show us that you still are the party of business.
There we go, wow. Proper cri de coeur there. Well, I suppose, given that you've been asking some questions of Liam, let's formalise this. What would be the top three, if you had three policies that the government would do before the next election to help small businesses, what would they be?
Number one, don't have a tax that before a small business on a high street opens their door and makes 1 penny of revenue, never mind 1 penny of profit, don't have that tax across some of the most vulnerable businesses in the UK. That's business rates. So we've asked the government to look at upping the threshold from a £12,000 value to £25,000 and take a quarter of a million of the smallest, most vulnerable businesses up and down the country out of business rates. That means you, ladies and gentlemen, will have a nicer high street. You know, you'll have more variety on the high street. And when one business closes, that you're seeing some of the bigger franchises closing across the country, and you see hundreds of the shops up and down every city in the UK close all at once, we're not vulnerable to that as much. So the first thing would be business rates. The second thing, and this doesn't cost the government a penny, and as a business person myself, I often like to think about growth and things that aren't about spending money as well. So we're aligned on that, Liam. Late payments. It might surprise you to find out that some of the late payments are actually sitting with some of the local authorities and some of the bigger businesses as well. They use it as cash flow. So many businesses up and down the country are closing and aren't able to open their doors again simply because they're being paid so late, and they are being used for late payments, and they're so small and vulnerable that maybe they've only got one big customer and a few smaller ones. They can't actually stand up to them. What are they going to do? Are they going to put their hand up? The Small Business Commissioner will say she struggles to get the examples because they don't want to put their hand up or put their head above the parapet and say, this particular big company won't pay me on time, because sometimes they really need that company. And we've given the government a really easy thing to do. Simply put it in the audit committees of these big companies, doesn't cost you a penny, and get it looked at as a target. That's an easy thing to do. I think another thing is with inflation, we've got to look at the VAT thresholds. So we've sat, you know, and the government, rightly so, has looked at things around inflation and talked a lot about inflation. But what about inflation when it hurts the small businesses? So we have this 85,000 threshold on VAT. It takes a full week for a small business a year to do the administration required to be VAT registered. They don't want to do it. It's too much time. It's not their skill set. We haven't moved that 85,000 threshold in years. It's got to be relooked at. The pound today, unfortunately, is not as not as valuable as the pound or a few days ago or even a few years ago. So we've got to look at, when do you link inflation to those types of thresholds for businesses? So it's essentially like being in a contract with my customer, and my customer is saying, oh, well, I'm really sorry, I know you're payroll has gone up, and I know all your costs have gone up, but I'm not increasing anything for you in your charge rates for the next 10 years. We've got to look at these things and put a correlated policy in for where there's thresholds that really affect the smallest businesses. So there are three things that I think could really, really help the economy and actually put more money in the coffers of the Conservative government in order that they can overcome some of the biggest issues, like, for example, the waiting lists.
Thank you. Now, Liam, in your role as contextualiser, some of these issues, business rates, VAT thresholds, they're perennial, right? Like you can't do a year on year, you can't do a business event, especially for small businesses. VAT it affects a lot of freelance journalists, just to declare an interest.
I hope you're a member of ours.
I'm a member of NHTSA, I think. But anyway, so why is it? What are the barriers to getting this through, given that there seems to be, whenever I do a lot of these events, an awful lot of consensus about the barriers that some of these issues create? Why are they still not done?
Well, you pick up the papers today and you've got my colleagues calling for reductions in personal taxation. If I were the Chancellor and I had extra money, or money at all, to give away, I'd be putting money into, exactly as Tina said, the bits of the economy that can create and generate more wealth in the future, rather than short-term consumption. And I think that's, we have to, the Prime Minister's been talking about how we need to get away from our addiction to the short term and start to do things in the longer term. And one of those things is to not, I'm afraid not, to attractive, as I find personally, reductions in personal taxation, but to recognise what our priorities need to be as soon as we've got any economic headroom at all. And it seems to me that giving money off income tax so that people can spend more on consumer goods, or giving businesses a break that actually will create more prosperity and jobs in the long term, for Conservatives should be a no-brainer. I mean, we'd love to be able to do both, but it's simply not going to be possible. And I very much, and I think that the three things that Tina said very much would be the top of mind. Certainly, small business rate relief is got to be something that's dealt with. As a constituency MP, you get this all the time. And the VAT threshold is also another thing. I would actually be quite happy for us to legislate to stop local authorities being late payers, and actually bring it within the legislative framework that this is public money, and public money should not be used to disadvantage private business, which is in some cases what it is. And I can't see that being a big major hurdle, getting that through the House of Commons with our colleagues, and it sort of surprises me that we've not done that. But Tina raised one or two other things that I think we need to think really hard about, and would be interesting to hear what this audience thinks. So, she was talking about the difference between Europe, you were talking about the difference between Europe and the United States. So since just before the pandemic, since the final quarter of 2019, our economy, back to the phrase I don't like, but has grown 1.8%, France 1.7%, Germany under 0.5%, the United States 6.4%. So what is it in the same global economic environment that the United States has been able to do in terms of growing its economy and its prosperity that we haven't? And I think it goes back to a number of the things that we've already mentioned. I think access to capital is a really big one. I mean, the government have done some really good things. The startup loan scheme, for example, that's 100,000 businesses that have benefited from that. The British Business Bank supporting 96,000 businesses at the present time at the cost of 12.2 billion. These are good things. Innovate UK does a lot of good things to help small business. So there are some very good things going on, but there's still this very big chasm between what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic and what is happening to most European economies. So why, I think, is a really key question. Some of the micro things that we've mentioned are true, but I think that there's also this element about, are we too dependent on banks? I mean, Tina mentioned banks several times. Are we too bank dependent as a model in terms of how we finance private business in this country, and what can we do about it? And the other thing about the United States is there is a cultural difference in terms of how they view failure. If you've got a start-up and it fails, my friends in America will say, yeah, it may take you 8 till you get the right one. Whereas in Britain, if you fail, it's regarded as a culturally bad thing that you should somehow feel guilty about. And I think there are, macro things that we need to do. I think there are cultural things that we need to do. And I think that there are practical things in terms of access to capital. But I don't disagree with any of the things that Tina says, except for the one about local government, where I think that it should not be an option for local government, for a public body using public money to disadvantage private business, and there is something we could do about that.
So before I throw it out, I'm just going to ask one follow-up question on that, because it's kind of like a nerdy implementation question, and that's my jam. So on the question of local government, and indeed on late payment enforcement generally, how would you enforce it? Because, you know, I write a lot about, you know, housing and planning. Planning departments have targets. They don't hit them. There's no consequences for not hitting them, right? So what teeth could you give this, not just for local government, but also for the large businesses which don't pay, to make sure that there are actually consequences and incentives for them to comply? Because otherwise, all that will happen is in 2 or 3 years' time, if you passed a meaningless, a toothless target, you'd have X percent of local government not complying.
My question would come back to you, Henry, which is why do we apply responsibilities to individuals, directors, for example, in a private company, that we never apply to either elected councillors or officials in local government, who seem to be able to evade many of the responsibilities that would be applied in the private sector. I don't see why we should draw the distinction, and I wouldn't.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. All right, then. Right, so we're moving on to the Q&A section of the evening. If you've done a Con Home event before, you know how this works. We have 2 people with microphones. I'll take 2 questions at a time. Please stand up, introduce yourself. Let us know if the question is directed to any individual panellist. And the usual spiel, it's about questions. It's not about statements. Please try and keep the questions concise so we can keep a good debate going. So we'll have the gentleman there in the 3rd row and the gentleman there in the 4th row. Sir, stand up and ask a question, please. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Anton. I'm a businessman. I'm running a company in London. And the question is to Dr. Liam Fox. So there is a government-backed program called Startup Business Loan. And we try to fill the details there. And unfortunately, the questionnaire is so complicated that by the time you get to the end, the project would already probably fail. But the second problem that it's a loan. It's not a donation or something. And it's limited to only 25,000. And these days, what 25,000s are, it's probably 1/3 or 1/4 of whatever the project would cost to launch digitally. Probably even less than that. So, and the third, eventually, it's the loan. So the loan that you have to repay. And so how we can create a culture, a business culture, that would embrace risks and opportunities when actually taking the loan, you taking the responsibility and liability to repay it in case of failure. And that can ruin your life, your business. And
is there a question? What's the question, please?
That's the question.
That's the
so, yeah, so can we actually have some kind of programs which would support entrepreneurs, not making them indebted to the government?
Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you. Gareth Lyon from the IAB. Both speakers talked about businesses scaling up. At the IAB, our evidence suggests that small and medium-sized enterprises which are able to make use of digital marketing and AI and other technologies like that are able to attain some of the fastest growth in the country. But from what we keep hearing from small businesses, they simply have not got the time to make proper use of it. So what can be done, or what could the government stop doing to help small businesses to be able to make better use of these kind of technologies?
Okay. Do you want to start with?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question you pose. First of all, business likes to pay its way. So it isn't about being given handouts, that's for sure, especially in the United Kingdom. Remember, when we talk about the tax that's taken in the United Kingdom, SMEs pay their tax in this country. You know, they like to pay their way. I think that access to finance is still a huge issue. And even with the work that's being done on pensions, which is interesting, I think for bigger businesses, if I'm honest, when I looked at it, and maybe I need to look at it more, but when you look at things like SEISS and the other schemes that are out there, I think they're better for slightly bigger businesses. But something, for example, I think about often is many entrepreneurs up and down the country have pensions. You know, a lot of people come out of jobs and start businesses. And the rules around pensions in the United Kingdom are so tight that I can't even get access to my pension fund to put it into my business myself, you know, as a self-invested pension. There are billions owned by the entrepreneurs in this country that there are certain rules, things they can invest in through some of these schemes, into other types of companies that have met certain criteria. But can they take their own pension out and invest it directly into their own business and create more wealth, productivity, opportunity and jobs? Not so easy. So I think there are easier ways for the government to help entrepreneurs, especially those that are just starting out, to get access to their own cash to invest in themselves, right? And sorry, in terms of your question, I didn't really understand the question, if I'm honest. Yeah. Yeah. So SMEs will always, by their very nature, struggle to give time to things that bigger businesses have, for example, IT managers, project managers, HR managers, etc. So we've got to look, especially with the closing of a lot of LEPs around the country, you know, and we've got to look at what business support is out there, because business support with a wraparound finance is really what helps small businesses. So not just the finance, but wraparound business activities. Now, I have to give a shout out to the FSB, because with 150,000 members, we are the largest business organisation in the UK. And what came really clearly from our members is they love us speaking honestly to government, and you can tell we do, and building good relationships with government, but also they also needed services, and we're providing a lot of the services. Now, Liam talks about the US quite a lot. In the US, they have the Small Business Administration, and when I went to visit, it's brilliant. When I went to visit them, they kind of do what we do for our members. And so I think there's also maybe a conversation around, do we have something like the Small Business Association in the UK government to help and support small businesses? There could be something specifically there for small businesses. And when you look at the outcomes in the US of the small business community, they're much better than the outcomes here. But that's because they're getting the wraparound support as well as the access to finance. So,
Hey, Liam.
So if I may have misunderstood the point, but if the point was that we should be giving taxpayer-funded grants rather than loans, no way. Businesses that can't repay their loans, that's fair enough, but the idea that a company that is successful shouldn't repay any of the capital that it got at the beginning, I don't think is a conservative policy, so I'm in favour of the loan scheme. And you say it's very difficult to make it work, but we're above 100,000 companies that have taken out small loan schemes, so clearly a lot of them have been able to deal with some of those issues around paperwork, and that's more than £1 billion worth of support that's been given through those loans. I don't quite agree with Tina. I think that SEIS and EIS are actually very useful for small companies. I've got a number of companies in my own constituency who've done extremely well as startups, being able to utilise that. But I think perhaps the difficulty in that is knowing which individuals you can access who've got the right profile to be able to invest in that. And I think that so a lot of companies who are quite well connected, so perhaps in wealthier constituencies, have actually got the basic raw materials, if you like, to be able to use those schemes better. What has also surprised me is that when I've had local companies trying to get investment through that scheme, how few people understand how generous the scheme is and how it can really take risk away from investment into small companies. So I think we have got quite a lot of work to do, I think, to tell people here is a way in which you can help in investment at relatively low risk to yourself. So I think that's a good thought. I'll take that back from that. Can you take out your own personal pension to invest it elsewhere? Well, I can just imagine the Treasury's horror at the concept of after having spent all the time getting people to have a personal pension to see them through.
It probably would do better than what it's done linked to the markets recently.
Well, that's
it's dead money.
Well, this is the big reform. This is the question about pension funds being able to invest it. It really irritates in my constituency that Canadian pension funds can invest in businesses in my constituency and make a very tidy profit from it, but our own pension funds, including your pension and my pension, have not up till this point been able to do it. So the reforms that Jeremy's been talking about are very welcome. It's a radical idea of being able to take out your personal pension to invest it in a sort of SEIS, EIS way. I have to say I hadn't thought about that before, but it's, I'm now going to have to wait and think about that one.
That's my gift to you, Liam. That's my gift.
The American one again is I think that their small businesses are in a different environment because their access to capital, I hate to keep going back to this, but their access to capital is fundamentally different. They're not caught in this bank lending model to the extent that our businesses are. Their access to private equity is so much greater, and we simply don't have the breadth of that market in the UK. Now, how you go about changing that is quite difficult, but I think that needs to be an aim of government, that we have to widen the availability of capital, because frankly I think the banking model, which is, you know, I borrow this amount of money, I've got to pay it back, sell my business on, you know, take the money and buy a house in Marbella, whatever, is very different from the sort of what people would call patient capital, but I would call smart capital, which actually takes a much longer view of investment and produces a very different outcome. I have to say, without telling any tales out of school, that the Treasury have always been deeply resistant to the idea that it produces a very different cultural outcome, private equity versus bank lending. And I think that I can remember one chancellor that I had a very heated discussion with who simply didn't accept that there was a difference about where the lending came from. And I constantly said, look at the US model, look at what small businesses can get in terms of access. It's a debate which I'm surprised we've not had more of in the UK. Maybe we can, after this, we can have a discussion about how we can push that as a project.
What about, just quickly before I throw out to the audience, this idea of was it the Small Business Administration in America? Because you were just talking about the fact that a lot of British businesses, apparently, especially in poor parts of the country, don't struggle to access schemes that already exist. They don't realise the breadth and scope of it. And Tina was talking about how one of the things that they have in America, which we could possibly replicate, is better wraparound care from the government. So is that something that could potentially be looked at?
I think it's something. Well, it's certainly something when I was at DIT that we looked at, which was how do we get our businesses on the road that will ultimately get them to become exporters.
Yeah.
And again, too few of our businesses that could export do export. And I think it's caught up in a sort of slightly risk-averse environment, which is not the fault of businesses. And I think that if we are able to use business DIT, whatever it's called nowadays, and to use that to provide that with where companies go at the moment to look for expertise in exporting, why would they not go there to look for expertise on investment? Which is, I was just doing a meeting earlier, and I said that when we set up the Department for International Trade, I wanted it to be called the Department for International Trade and Investment. But no one in Whitehall wanted anything called DITI for reasons that still elude me. But if you're doing that and you see the role of that government department as giving advice on investment right down to the very bottom level of startups, I think that might be a way to redress that.
Okay, wonderful. Right, we'll have the gentleman in the third row on the aisle and the lady in the fourth row there with her hand raised. The microphone is coming to you. Sir, thank you.
Hi, my name is Manas Deb. I run a small manufacturing business. Although it's small, but it's mature. It turns over £2 million. So my question is going to be more focused, slightly different to the other two gentlemen asked. I feel the government has left us high and dry to survive. Now, obviously...
I'm going to urge you to come to a question in a few sentences, please.
My question is, can government subsidize softer bank loan? I don't have problem getting bank loans based on accounts, but the trouble is, how can we make further investment in the business if we get loan at 10 to 12% interest, which is not commercially viable at all? And the second question is, can government reduce the corporation tax to make us more, to incentivize us to invest more in the business? These are the two questions I have.
Thank you. Madam?
Hello, hi, I'm Sam, I'm from the Finance Innovation Lab and we're coordinating the Fair Banking for All campaign. I joined a bit late, so sorry if this was already picked up at the start, but this figure's probably changed. But in 2019, Mark Carney said that SMEs faced a finance gap of 22 billion and SMEs in deprived areas struggle even more to secure the lending that they need. Community development finance institutions are very effective at lending to SMEs and social enterprises. In 2022, 99% of the SMEs they lent to had already been rejected by mainstream finance. And yet, CDFIs themselves face huge barriers to scaling up and being as effective as they know they can be. Some mainstream...
What's the question?
The question is, I need some context. Some mainstream institutions have worked with CDFIs to provide ad hoc funding, and that's been really welcome. But isn't it time the UK government used its legislative powers to create a framework to ensure that mainstream banking institutions, responsible finance providers and the regulator work together to make sure that the financial exclusion experienced by SMEs is addressed? Talking about a Fair Banking Act, it's got its precedents in the USA with the Community Reinvestment Act.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tina?
Yeah, I'll start with that one actually because I like it. There's definitely an issue with how traditional financing used to work and now doesn't. So everybody back 20 years ago knew who their local branch manager was at their local bank who provided their loan within their business. You know, I think there's a revolution in banking still to come around some of the challenger banks that have entered the market. I just think traditional banking is a bit on its head, and I guess the banks still kind of are waking up to that. I do think the British Business Bank is picking up out there and some of the work they're doing out in the regions. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work with them in Northern Ireland, for example, and they're really picking up where people traditionally go for finance. And it's interesting because when you look at this isn't a government problem, this is a cultural issue within small businesses that who they trust and who they trust to go and get finance from. So they may go to their local bank and the bank might say no, and indeed we've seen cases where the banks actually say they don't want their business, never mind give them a loan anymore. But actually they'll go to other kind of community groups. So I think there's definitely something around looking at what the government could do to build a better framework around the regions to help those SMEs, and whether that's through a community finance hub framework or whatever way it is. There's definitely there's a gap there, and if they close the gap, it wouldn't cost them any more money. It's simply closing the gap, and it would create a lot more investment, especially in the places where we need it. So I think that for sure. And I think to your question about interest rates, and thank you for investing, and thank you for having that business, and thank you for employing people, and thank you for keeping manufacturing in this country, because it's really important we have something other than professional services. It's very difficult to invest if these are the interest rates, but what we'll hear, I suspect from Liam, is that in order to get the interest rates down, we need to get inflation down. So I'm going to give him another gift. If he was to reduce the duty on fuel, that's really helping drive keeping the inflation up, then that would really help small businesses and also help us with inflation. That might help with the interest rates. But equally, a community framework of finance could also help with those interest rates as well.
Liam, you're being showered with gifts.
And I'm not taking that one. Because if you look at core inflation, which excludes fuel prices, our core inflation is still quite high. I'm one of those who was a long-standing critic of the Bank of England, who believed that the Bank of England did not tighten monetary policy when they should have. They allowed loose money to continue for far too long post-pandemic. And I'm old-fashioned in the view that I think inflation is a monetary phenomenon. I think if you keep money supplied too loose for too long, you will get inflation. This idea that the so-called new monetarists have, I won't name any by name, other than the Governor of the Bank of England, who seem to believe that you can expand monetary policy without creating inflation. You can't. We've now shown yet again, if there were any doubts, that you can't do that. So I think that there are other ways to get that down. I think what's becoming a real theme in this conversation, interestingly, is one way or another, there is a problem in our economy with access to capital. If too little of the lending is coming from the banks, there's too little competition on the banks to offer at lower rates of interest. And the answer is not for the government to intervene. The answer is for a wider range of capital being made available to businesses, and that's what I think a Conservative government should be doing, not interfering any more with the banks. I mean, to be fair to them, which I'm not very often, the banks have been told simultaneously to improve their balance sheets and to lend more. You know, that's quite a trick if you can do it. I mean, my wife would love to know how you can spend more and save more simultaneously at any moment.
They're doing it really well with the increased interest rates not being passed on in as quick a fashion as what you might think on the savings accounts. They're making billions.
So I think our economy is too heavily banking orientated, and I've argued this for quite a long time. And I think that, you know, over and over again from all these different contributions that we're hearing much the same thing expressed in different ways, which is that we need to have a big debate in Britain about our access to capital. Again, that point, the very interesting point that the lady there made about poorer areas of the country is very much the point I was making to Tina about schemes like SEIS and EIS that are actually harder to access. They're great schemes, but they're harder to access if you don't have enough wealthy individuals in an area willing to take the risk and be wealthy enough to do that in the first place. And it's definitely something I thought I'm taking away from this, is how I think that might get remedied. On the question of the corporation tax, I think in some ways we've got the worst of both worlds, because with the taper on corporation tax, it didn't actually raise any more money, but it did increase the headline rate. And if you look at the factors that produce Britain's very high level of foreign direct investment, and you go down the numbers as they go. Number one reason for FDI into Britain, our legal system. That's what our investors will tell you. Number two, the flexibility of the labour market, including the skills. Number three, the stability of the regulatory framework. Number four, the permissibility of the taxation system. English skills, availability of tech, cooperation with higher education, and IP protection. These are all the elements that tons of academic work's been done on it. My fear about the corporation tax was it didn't actually raise any money, but it raised internationally what looked like the headline rate. And so the Exchequer didn't benefit from any extra income, but there was undoubtedly a downside in terms of FDI. And if we're looking for more manufacturing in the UK, we will require foreign direct investment to help us do that. And so I think this was one of those things where it was I can see it was well-intentioned. It was an answer to one problem, but as so often in politics, the law of unintended consequences was back in there, caused us to have the taper, and the taper meant we didn't benefit on either front, really.
Okay,
Is
right.
that unfair?
No, it's not. The only thing I'd add, I think you're absolutely right there. I also think that maybe a few other countries have stolen our clothes. If I look at the Republic of Ireland, equally flexibility, equal quality and talent in the labour market, and they're now posting huge multi-billion-pound surpluses and loads of investment, especially from the States. So I think that I would like to see a difference in the corporation tax. You know, we have this threshold of 19% up to 50 grand, and then it tapers up to the 25. I'd like to see that $250,000 be the point that we start that for small businesses, because I think that could really give them a bit of a push and a bit of encouragement and a bit of support as well, bearing in mind the level of inflation anyway.
Now, I think it's worth pointing out, though, just how successful Britain is in terms of FDI globally.
Yeah. That
really, over the last decade, behind China and the United States, we're the top in terms of the value of foreign direct investment coming into the UK. And one thing that I would point out in that is that we've got 4 of the top 10 global universities, and we shouldn't underestimate the value of that to our economy and the need to maintain our lead in higher education, because the ability to collaborate with some of our top universities is an absolute magnet to foreign direct investment. When you've got this recipe and it's largely working, for me the exam question is, how do I not interfere with that in a way that keeps that FDI coming? And I think the corporation tax, although there's no hard and fast data to show what impact it had on FDI, it has an impact on FDI sentiment.
So raising the CT threshold to 250,000, yay or nay?
I think you'd have to. That's not a question that I can answer. That's a question you'd have to look at cost-benefit analysis on.
It would make us money twice over.
Okay, fair enough.
And that's my gift to you. Bring me the paper that shows it.
Will do.
You're turning me into a supply teacher. I'm going to have to assert myself and go back to the audience. We'll have the lady in the second row there and the gentleman there in the blazer. Wonderful. So, sir?
Hi, Linus Pardo from the Good Food Institute. Liam, you just mentioned about universities. Sort of an open question about equity stakes in university spin-outs. Does that need to be looked at? Is that an area of opportunity?
Sorry, what was that?
Equity stakes?
Equity stakes in university spin-outs, an area of opportunity, something to look at.
Okay, madam.
Hello, I'm Angela. I am a franchisor. I have 50 female franchisees across the country. I'm also a local county councillor. My question is very specific for female entrepreneurs. They tend to be more risk averse. They tend to have smaller businesses on average. They need certain kinds of nurturing. What can the government do to support female entrepreneurs, please?
Okay, so
what can the not government do also to nurture? And I'm feeding that one into Tina of how the FSP help female entrepreneurs, which is a nice softball for you, on that one. And yeah, it's an interesting idea.
The panellists shouldn't be so nice to each other. I mean, because we're supposed to engineer sort of artificial discord in order to make it exciting for the viewers at home. Come on, guys.
That's worked well for the country.
Tina.
There's a few key... Females are not risk averse. I'm a female entrepreneur, as risky as any man in the room. Most women have got certain constraints. So, for example, we know that the women in the household are normally, not always, because my husband's a very good stay-at-home dad, but most women are primarily looking after the children, equally squeezed in the middle, sometimes looking after the parents. And it's always assumed that the women are going to do these jobs. Secondly, when women go for finance, they're 5 to 6 times more likely to be turned down than if they were a man. So I think until we sort out some of those issues in society, that women will not be stretching themselves in the way they could do, in the way they should do, in the way they would like to, if they could as entrepreneurs. So I don't think it's that we are less risky. It's that we're dealing usually, if the stats are right, with more.
Why is that question really? Why is that? If you're working within the same sets of rules, why should it be that women are 5 or 6 times less likely to get access to capital?
Well, it's interesting. Here's a different way of answering it. I just attended at 3:30 today a panel on childcare and childcare reform and access to childcare, which is fundamentally about our children and if we, and how our society will be in the next 20 years in terms of how we look after our children today, our babies in the nurseries, etc. 10 people showed up. So you ask yourself the question, do people get it? Do they actually get what's going on in terms of early years? What's going on in the home in terms of the pressure that's under parents about who can work, who can't? The availability or lack of availability of wraparound care? Some of the pressure that's on childcare providers that are closing their doors up and down the country? The business rates they have to pay in England, where they don't have to pay it in Scotland or Wales. So I think there's just some fundamental things, easy things that we could do to make life easier for female entrepreneurs. And one of the most important things is to make sure they can see them. Be them, see them. So when you go to the bank for a loan, it's making sure that there's representation, and I know across government it's a lot better than it used to be, but also in some of the other types of business councils, trade councils, no more manels. Let's get women up there so girls and young girls can see women doing business and doing it well.
And is it a regulatory or a legislative issue that could be dealt with, or is it purely a cultural issue in terms of that access to finance for women?
Yeah. So there's definitely, if you've got a huge, if I'm in my business, Liam, and I've got a problem with growth, and I look into why it's not growing, and I see one of the reasons it's not growing is I don't have access to the labour market. The reason I don't have access to the labour market, and this is to our economy, is simply because these people are restricted because there's no access to childcare. And I know you've legislated recently to come in 25, 26, but there's a real fundamental problem with the provision, and the law needs to change more on that. The 38 weeks is great. Everybody works 48 weeks. We need 48 weeks. The tariffs are too low for the childcare establishments to stay open. So the I think it was about it was 4 billion the government offered. Very, very welcome. I was delighted in the spring statement. Honestly, it's the first time I've heard childcare being put front and centre. But for it to work, we need to do a bit more work on it. So I think it is the government's responsibility, absolutely, to legislate. Equally, it's all of our responsibilities to encourage our girls to get out there and do what they want to do in life. But we can't kind of shackle them with all the responsibilities of society. You know, it's not fair. So, and where you can, as a government, legislate to help for that, I don't think government should be everywhere, definitely not. But where you can help, especially with the access to finance, I'd be saying to the banks, and I'd start with a British Business Bank. I want to know, British Business Bank, because you're my bank and I'm the government, I want to know how much of that money you're giving out is targeted to women, and I want to give you a target in the first instance, and then I want you to report on it, because we don't have the targets with that. We also need to then turn to the other banks and say, if you don't hit some of these targets, then we're going to ask the question, are you institutionally biased to women? Because that's maybe what it looks like when you're giving 80%, 85% of your funding to men. There's something wrong.
Okay, right, hold on.
No?
Sorry. No, sir,
I'll put down a PQ on that to get the information from the British Business Bank for you.
Yeah,
excellent.
I know, I work with them.
Right, we have time for one very last quick fire round of questions. I'm just going to let them keep going. Please be very brief. We have time just quickly. So, sir in the second row, and sir in the sixth row there with your hand raised. I'm guessing, but I think I got it right. Thank you, sir.
I own a company in Manchester. I'm a great supporter of FSB.
Can we have the microphone on? Okay. No, so just speak into the microphone.
Right, I'm a great supporter of FSB. I own a company in Manchester. And one of the great things that FSB do is they provide legal expenses insurance, which has been terrific. And I've known that for 20 years. They've recently introduced actually giving effectively accountancy expenses where there's an investigation by HMRC. Okay, that's something relatively new. And the playing field between SMEs and large companies with regard to that is totally unfair. It's something I'd like to raise with Tina, but I think it's a massive subject to look into, is how there isn't a level playing field for SMEs compared with major business in their dealings with HMRC, where the SMEs are in a David and Goliath situation without access to proper funding.
I hate to be, but I just want to get the other question in. We've got like 4 minutes left. Sir.
Thanks. My name's Henry Chown from Friends of the Earth. We are an environmental charity. We're interested in reaching net zero and retrofitting millions and millions of houses, all of which will be done by SMEs. We've seen a lot of those schemes over the years which have failed pretty spectacularly to help those SMEs to get established doing this kind of work. So, for instance, the Green Homes Grant, I was the only person who succeeded getting a grant through that. How would you design a scheme that would help SMEs to train staff, hire, buy new kit and all the stuff they'll need to do to get into this transition and make it actually happen?
Thank you.
Yeah, we've designed it. It's called Help to Green. And so it offers SMEs vouchers, and we proposed it to the government and fair dues to Grant Shapps, because he went with a pilot on it actually, and a bigger pilot than we asked for. So you've got to give him credit where credit's due. But we'd like to see that rolled out across the country. We will not get to net zero without the SMEs. It's a bit like when we talked about electric vehicles. SMEs are usually waiting on the second-hand white vans coming along. Never mind the first ones, because they can't afford them. So I think that SMEs will be at the heart of it, and we've got to help them, and Help to Go Green is a great way to do that. They're vouchers, they're controlled, the government can see exactly what's going on with it, and also look at, for example, what's going to happen to all the plumbers up and down the country and the gas fitters. They need to be retrained, and so the Help to Green vouchers can do that as well with some of those individual one-man bands that are going up and down the country fixing boilers, etc. On HMRC, wow, now, HMRC. So I think they're about to say, I've heard recently that we're going to stop the phone lines. Small businesses use the phone lines a lot. They're not online necessarily, can't always get online in parts of the country. They rely on talking to somebody sometimes. But one thing I'd like, this is another one, Liam, but we're becoming great friends, so I know you're going to do this. I'd love for HMRC to pay the overpayments, or the money that they owe small businesses, within 7 to 14 days, the way they ask it of us when we're late. Some people are getting their money paid back a year, 2 years later, and indeed, unless they spot it, they're not necessarily getting it either. So I'd love to see them on a fast payment model. That would really help small businesses as well.
There we go.
Yeah, you have to, as a constituency MP, the number of cases that you get of this, which is I have to pay what I owe them immediately. They don't pay me what they owe me for some time, and we have a real problem.
Yeah, we do.
With dealing with HMRC as MPs, I have to say, it can be really quite difficult to be able to make the case. Oh, I just want to say something about the housing element and net zero. One of the things that we have to do is open up the construction market to SMEs, to new and innovative builders. Yeah. And we have to open up the planning process to make it easier for SMEs to enter the market. And we've still got some time of the regeneration and levelling up bill to come. One of the things that I've always thought we should do was actually to make it easier in terms of planning for small developments to go ahead. Not big developments. In other words, do smaller developments that are more in tune with the local communities, which I just happened to open a children's playground in a 100% carbon neutral housing the other day. That would have not happened had it been a great big builder. It only happened because it was a relatively small development that the big builders weren't that interested in, and we got an SME builder to come into that. There are things that we can do to make the market work better so that we get more market entrance, and that our housing developments are not huge housing developments by 2 or 3 massive companies, but actually bring in smaller companies who are more responsive, I think also more innovative than you're likely to get otherwise. And I've seen examples of it myself, so I think that there are things that the government can do to open the market up to greater competition. I mean, if you're actually getting the result in terms of the environmental policy you want by a good old Conservative policy of increased competition in the market, that seems to me to be a win-win.
Lovely. Right, that brings us to the end of the hour. I'd like to firstly join me in thanking the panel. I think that was a really wonderful light to heat ratio. And I think that's the end of most of Conservative Homes events for today. Thank you to the FSB.